Welcome to tonight's program from the Exeter Historical Society. Tonight, author Glenn Knobloch is going to talk about historic and unusual weather vanes found in New Hampshire's churches, town halls, and other public buildings. Glenn is an independent scholar and author of 15 books and over 100 articles. He is also the author and historian on projects relating to Northern New England cities, New Hampshire cemeteries, brewing history, and African American military history. He has served as the main military contributor to Harvard and Oxford University's landmark African American biography project. He holds a BA in history from Bowling Green State University. Glenn has spoken to us before about Black Revolutionary War soldiers and the history of brewing beer in New Hampshire. We welcome him back. But before we get started, I have a couple of notes. First of all, if you are interested in learning more about Exeter's history, visit our website at exeterhistory.org. And if you're a member of the Society, we thank you. While this program is only virtual, our lunch program will be held at the Exeter Town Hall in person and also virtually via Zoom, Facebook Live, Exeter TV's YouTube channel, and Channel 98 at 7 p.m. on Tuesday, March 7th. Robert Hall will be discussing the recent history of the Downeaster. We hope you can join us. We will post the link to the Zoom registration page as soon as we have it. I'd like to thank Exeter TV for bringing this program to you through Zoom. And special thanks to the New Hampshire Humanities for sponsoring tonight's program. At the end, you will be directed to an online questionnaire about the program, and we would really appreciate it if you would fill it out. It helps the New Hampshire Humanities with their program offerings and helps them continue to allow us to offer them as well. So tonight, Glenn will be taking questions after the program. I will be monitoring the Q&A dialog box at the bottom of your screen. I don't think I introduced myself. I'm Laura Martin, one of the co-executive directors of the Historical Society. You can type your questions in the Q&A dialog box at the bottom of the screen, and I will also attempt to monitor our Facebook page for questions. And if you're listening on Facebook, you can write your questions in the comments. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Glenn. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. I'm going to switch over screens here now so we can get that shared. I just want to reiterate that this program, again, sponsored by the New Hampshire Humanities. I've been a part of them for almost 2 decades now, and am very proud to have done so. So they have a lot of great programs that Exeter and many other towns throughout New Hampshire are presented. So if you're not acquainted with them, go on their website and you can see many other lecturers and speakers that are giving programs with them. So they're a great organization. And of course, they use only private monies. This program is coming to you free of charge, courtesy of them. So once again, a cultural icon in New Hampshire, which if you ever feel like supporting, I'm sure they would welcome that as well. So I thank them. I'm also excited to be back in Exeter, virtually anyway. This Weathervane project that I actually started in Exeter many years ago when I lived in Exeter and then Stratham for a while before moving to Wolfboro, New Hampshire, which is where I'm coming to you from tonight. So I have many fond memories of Exeter and the surrounding area, and I appreciate Laura and the Society inviting me back. The subject tonight is based on a full-length book I wrote about New England weather vanes. So this distills out the part about New Hampshire, my home state. So at the end, I'll give you a little information on the book. That's the only sales pitch you get. And we'll take questions at the end, too. I always like to ask everybody this question. We don't always think of weather vanes as artwork, but that's indeed what they are. They're part of our New Hampshire skyline. That's kind of a funny term, isn't it? Skyline. We think of that term when it comes to big cities, Boston, New York, of course, Chicago, wherever. But New Hampshire has its own skyline too. And for example, if you're down in Hudson, New Hampshire, and around the high school there, you might see this spooky weather vane in memory of beloved teacher there, William Webb Palmer. So there's lots of interesting things to be seen in the sky if we just look up. And we're going to talk about how this today, this folk art developed from a practical meteorological device to what it is today, a little bit of artwork in the sky. We all know we're looking at our phones, looking down all the time. That's just part of our everyday life. Our ancestors were doing the same thing, a little bit differently, right? Hands and shoulders and elbows to the plow or to the washboard or whatever. But our ancestors also knew that they had to look at the sky, okay? Back in the days when we didn't have our weather apps on our phones or WMUR weather on TV to tell us what was coming, they had to use the signs around them. So look up at the sky, so to speak. And the way the wind blows really tells us a lot about what's happening in the weather. Is a nor'easter coming? And farmers, especially back then, even today, but especially back in the earliest times, really had to pay attention to which way the wind was blowing. Here we see an example of a very fine weather vane in the form of that mythological creature, the centaur, atop an otherwise ordinary barn on the Mack family property down in Londonderry. So even farmers got in the act and kind of spruced up their barns a little bit. Now, the earliest wooden weather vanes were made of wood, and they were very simply carved in New Hampshire. And they're bringing over a tradition that dates back, thousands of years in Europe. The first weather vanes that we know of really, the Tower of the Winds in Athens, Greece, in the BC time, so to speak, was very popular and was subsequently copied by many, wealthy Romans who, erected these little weather stations on their villas and stuff, things with a weather vane and early barometers and things like that. But really, the weather vane even dates farther back in time. If you think of a cloth flag flying from a pole, that's what a weather vane is, right? It's telling us the direction from which the wind is blowing. And they morph from a cloth, disposable object eventually to metal. We see that also in the flags that flew over the castles and ramparts of Europe and things like that. So, and we still see remnants of that today. The weather sock in our local and regional airports is just another form of a weather vane telling us which way the wind blows. Now, there are weather vanes that we know of in the form that we think of. They actually do have a variety of components. That it's important to remember what these parts do. So if we look at the spindle, that long rod that goes through the spire of a building, that's what holds the weather vane. That's the mount for the weather vane. And just as much of the spindle as you see outside of the spire of the given building, there's much more inside the spire. It has to be anchored securely, and not only that, it has to be straight. So they're very solidly anchored inside and braced properly to withstand our New England weather. For a spindle that is not straight, it's canted to one side, even just a little bit, the weather vane will not spin in the wind. And then we have the vane itself. And the weather vane really has two parts. It has the aft part. You can see the arrow there pointing to the vane part. That's the part, think of that like the sail on a ship. That's the part that catches the wind. And then you have the forward part, the directional, that tells us from which way the wind is coming from. That weather vane, the whole component has to be equally balanced on that spindle. If one end weighs more than the other, then the vane will not spin properly. If any of you have ever bought a cheap weather vane and wonder why it doesn't spin in the wind very easily, that's probably because it's not properly balanced. Now, I know you're looking at that picture and saying, Glenn, there's no way that those parts of the vane are equally balanced. Surely the vane, the aft part of the weather vane, is heavier. Well, that's a light sheet of copper there. The forward part, you can see the arrow and the ball forward are actually three-dimensional. They're actually hollowed out and have lead weights in them. So this is one trick that weather vane makers use to kind of balance their weather vanes. There was one Seacoast weather vane back in the 70s, right on Route 1 that was very well known. They used to test his weather vanes by mounting them on the back of his pickup and driving up and down I-95. If he could see it spinning crazily in the wind as he was going up and down the highway, he knew he had it right. So that's balance is key, and a proper spindle. Now, the cardinal points, very simplistic. Some weather vanes have them, some don't. Today, I see many decorative weather vanes that north and south aren't even correct. And that's because our weather vanes today are mostly decorational. But back in the day, if a farmer put up a barn, he had to use a compass and make sure that he got that weather vane correctly so that he knew where true north was. Any farmer that did not have his cardinal points properly aligned would have been made fun of. And finally, the decorative stuff. You see the finial and the ball slightly below that up top. Those are just merely decorational. Eventually, lightning rod components would become part of the weather vane, but that took place much later, late in the 19th century. And before then, we often see weather vanes, and beside them you'll see a lightning rod. So the two combined together and grounded is a relatively recent occurrence in the history of the weather vane. Now, the earliest weather vanes were simple arrows. Again, simplistic, but they get the job done. They tell the tale. Here we see the New Hampton Community Church has a very simple arrow weather vane with some nice, you can see the points of the compass. They're not delineated north, east, west, and south, but they're there. And here we see a Farmington barn from the 1890s. Again, has a simple arrow, and this does have a lightning rod incorporated into its design. It's been the most popular design throughout the history of the weather vane, despite its simplicity, and remains so to this day. We see it mounted on many different types of buildings. So the arrow is the oldest. Now, early weather vanes were made of wood in New Hampshire, okay? And that's why we don't have well, there may be one surviving example in the New Hampshire Historical Society Museum, but other than that, there are no survivors. When these weather vanes were first made, they were purely weather instruments. They were not considered folk art or anything like that, and they were disposable. Once they wore out with time and weather, they were replaced. So eventually, by the 1690s, we start to see more fancy weather vanes going atop, again, meeting houses and later on barns and things like that. So that's when the coppersmith comes into play. But early on, they were made of wood. And again, simple arrow form, especially our Puritan ancestors would not have decorated them heavily. That was not their way. When metals were starting to be used, interestingly enough, the first metal weather vanes were made of wrought iron. And there are a number of these that survive across New England, none in New Hampshire. And you might think, well, wow, wrought iron is such a heavy metal. Doesn't matter how heavy the metal is. If it's properly balanced on the spindle and the weather vane is properly constructed, it'll spin in the wind. Actually, the largest weather vane in the world, to my knowledge, unless it's been surpassed, is an actual DC-3 aircraft mounted atop a pole at Yukon's Whitehorse Airport. It'll spin in a 5-knot wind, and it really gives pilots of that airport a good visual outside of their fancy instrumentation to tell them which way the wind is blowing as they make their takeoffs there. So even something as large as a DC-3 aircraft, if it's mounted properly, will spin in the wind. So it was all about wrought iron at first, and later copper and brass became the most popular metals because they were light, easy to fashion, and would stand the test of time in the sky and in our New England weather. Now, the banner style weather vanes are really cool and became very popular style for over 200 years in New Hampshire and New England. So these are, things that really, when we talk about banner style, they kind of harken back to the medieval times. And there's many different styles of the banner weather vane. Almost many of them have an astronomical theme for their tail, a star. The one on the left for the United Church up in Pennacook is pretty cool because you can see that ball in the center of the star, which again is hollowed out and filled with lead weights. Notice also the tail of that vane is in the shape of the lyre, that ancient Greek instrument. Many of our weather vanes actually have religious connotations to them. The lyre was considered a Christian symbol of joy and practicing their faith. So we see that above many meeting houses and places of worship. You can see another example here over in the town of Chester, something that's a little less elaborate, nonetheless still beautiful. And so the banner styles really remain very popular right through Victorian era times. And again, many different forms. However, it's the swallowtail style that was the earliest banner style that was used in our state. And it was used, first in places like Rye, above the meeting house there, and other places in Massachusetts and beyond. And we can see a couple fine examples in Portsmouth on the St. John's Church there, the fine banner style weather vane. And these really harken back to the castles again of medieval Europe. If you can imagine a flag like that flying on the standard of a king's army, or again over the ramparts of their castle, this is just a version of that flag in metal design. Now, New Englanders had an acerbic wit to them a little bit, and they had a nickname. They called this the Long John weather vane, resembling that piece of winter clothing hanging on a line, so to speak. And the one in Fitzwilliam certainly shows you that, right? It really does look like a pair of long johns hanging off the clothesline there, if you can envision that. Many of the fine meeting houses, by the way, in the Monadnock region feature these banner-style weather vanes. So they really evoke a different look to them altogether, and kind of give us a more ancient feel to some of our buildings. Now, why are meeting houses and churches using this? Well, first of all, remember these banners based on, practices carried over from Europe denote the most important buildings in our public spaces, right? The church, the meeting house, the town hall. And many of these buildings were situated on the highest eminences in a given town, on the hilltops there. So long before a traveler would come into a town like Fitzwilliam or New Boston or whatever, they would see these weather vanes flying from a distance. And that was a signal to them. That's my spot. That's where the center of town is. That's where I need to go. So they really are a showplace, and they're a symbol kind of authority too. So that's important to remember. The Jaffrey Meeting House, built in 1776, it's a bell tower added in 1822, including the weather vane. Is considered one of the most beautiful weather vanes in New Hampshire. And again, it's got that astronomical tail. And I also like the astronomical tail, by the way, because that really harkens back to the pagan times when, once again, ancient farmers had to look to the winds and the way the wind blew, tell them when to pull in their harvest and when to plant and so on and so forth. So it really harkens back long before even medieval Europe, when our ancestors in New Hampshire and even beyond were looking to the stars and the sky. What I also like is the heart-shaped body of the rear portion of the weather vane. And again, this has religious significance. The Sacred Heart of Jesus is mentioned in the Bible hundreds of times. So again, today, to us, it kind of looks like just a fancy symbol, some nice scroll work, but it actually had religious significance to it. Now, notice there's no points that tell us from which way the wind is blowing. By this time, the meeting house, really, again, this important building in town, it wasn't all about forecasting the weather or telling us from which direction the wind was blowing. By the 1770s, many of these had moved from the realm of practical meteorological device to ornamentation, architectural ornamentation. So that occurred gradually, and still above some of our other buildings, they were much more simpler in nature. The material you see here, again, is copper. Copper and brass were the most popular materials to be used, again, because they were lightweight, could be easily hammered out into thin sheets. Brass was important, especially in the seacoast area, because they used a form of brass called naval brass, slightly different composition than regular brass, and it can withstand the salt in the air in seacoast area towns. So what is also important to remember is our ancestors liked a weather vane that was fully gilded and gleaming in the sky there. Today, if you buy a weather vane, you probably want that verdigris look to it. You can't wait for it to weather, and many of them are artificially weathered to look old. But that's a really relatively early 20th century feature. The arts and crafts movement, when weather vanes became popular again after falling out of favor. And they wanted that old-fashioned look. But back in the day, in the 1770s or the 1820s, any town, if they had their meeting house with a worn or weather vane, would have spent the money to get it gilded. Many of these were gilded with 23-karat copper, very thin sheets applied in little squares there. So it's the coppersmith or the blacksmith working with someone with a little bit more skill to gild these. But in some towns, like Hampstead, they still used wood, and they often paint their weather vanes in a yellowish ochre color that gleamed in the sky and looked like gold. So it all depended on where you were at. Now, because these were not considered works of art necessarily, we don't always know the name of weather vane makers. However, there are some instances where we do know their names. Many of our meeting houses and churches were publicly built or communal structures, right? Not only for community worship, but they were also built communally. Everybody in the given town, like Bedford or Stratham, would contribute their skills, money, or materials to aid in the building of these structures. So they really were community in nature. And every once in a while, we get a glimpse through the records that tells us who made these weather vanes. What's really cool on the left, and both of these churches, by the way, were built in 1832. So that's kind of fascinating that in that year anyway, we know of two weather vanes and we know their makers. In Bedford, it was Nathaniel Kendall, who is said to have hung his weather vane on one of his old crowbars. And you can really see that on the left there. And he did an astronomical feature. We don't know. We believe it represents the phases of the moon, perhaps, but it may also be a representation of the solar system. His weather vane cost $5 to make. That's what he was reimbursed by the town for it. And it's flown all those years since then. So notice the forward parts you've got very much resembles in some ways the tip of a crowbar. And you've got the the crescent moon there, and then you've got the thinner sheets aft that represent either the phases of the moon or perhaps some planets visible in the sky. So I really like that. That's one of my favorites. Now, as a former resident of Stratham, the Stratham Community Church Weathervane holds a special place in my heart. It's a beautiful, simple, but yet beautiful building, and it's topped off by this Weathervane that was built by a local mechanic. So he was called a mechanic. Back in the day, if you were a metal worker with extra skills, you weren't just a blacksmith, you were a mechanic. And that's what Joseph Emery was. Anybody that knows Stratham knows that this church is located on Emery Lane. His farm was very close by, and out his kitchen window, he could see his contribution to the church. There are descendants of the Emery family today in Stratham, and they were, of course, very proud of this Weathervane. This is almost certainly a near copy of the Jaffrey Weathervane that I just showed you, or a very close approximation of it. It is not as finely wrought as the Jaffrey Weathervane, but nonetheless is very well done. And it's a beautiful piece of kind of the rural craftsman's work. And what I like about it, you can even see in the picture there, you can see the various marks, the hammer strikes where this mechanic made this right on his own farm, just a very short distance away from the church. And there it is, still flying in the sky today in Stratham. Unfortunately, for most other Weathervane makers, we don't know who made them. Again, they were local townsmen, certainly knew who crafted them. Again, this was it was not important to know who made them at the time. The Victorian era banners are kind of interesting that they kind of start to add some new features to it. We often see the fleur-de-lis or clover leaf designs. And also Victorians also use the banner in a shortened, more stubby style in a couple different manners. We can see some of the cutout design on the East Kingston's Methodist Church, but they also use Weathervanes, as in Northampton Centennial Hall, as kind of cornerstone designs that, the cornerstone of many public buildings gives etched in stone is the name of the builder and the date the building was built. Here, they've done that in Weathervane form in the sky. So, and we can see that up there. So lots of curly Q and swirling designs, sometimes less religious in nature. But again, that's what the Victorians is all about, the Victorian flourish. And these were very popular, for a good 30, 40 years. What is interesting, if you can often know a Victorian house, era house, not only by its turrets and other, gingerbread lacework design, architecturally speaking, but you'll also often see a banner style Weathervane with an initial. And usually it's, of course, the initials of the owner. Many of these Weathervanes have been lost over the years as houses are sold. And of course, if your name is Smith and you don't want a Weathervane with a K flying over your house, so you take it down and you either replace it or you don't. So many of these initial banner style Weathervanes have ended up in town dumps over the years. Some, like in the town of New Boston, have been salvaged by local residents. So anytime you see a Victorian era with a nice building with a turret on it with a blank spire on it, there's a very good chance there was an initial banner Weathervane on there that either got taken down or it came down due to the weather or otherwise deteriorated. So that brought a different style to our Weathervanes. Now, our Weathervanes can tell different stories and they have different influences, believe it or not. Yes, Weathervanes are influenced by different factors. Some of them are very localized. Some of them are more regional or national. For example, the Somersworth High Street Church, now the VFW Hall, has once had a very nice Weathervane. It's now in deteriorated condition. It's not going to be with us for much longer. You can see the forward part is very deteriorated. You can see the lyre style body on the back is missing most of its strings but one. You can see the remnants of the astronomical tail there, the many-pointed star. But what I like about this is notice that other elements, the compass and set square, the symbol of the Masonic temples. And indeed, some members of this church were members of a local Masonic church, which is long gone in Somersworth now. And they donated this weather vane to the church. So we see their influence and, again, donation to the church that they attended. Now, Exeter's First Congregational Church is one of the finest federal era buildings in New England. It's a beautiful building. I feature it in my book, New Hampshire Historic Churches and Meeting Houses. But what is interesting, the grandness of this building right there on Front Street, built by some local and regional builders who were very active, and they were trained architects. The weather vane, in my mind, is always not really matched up to the grandness of the building itself. And so we look at that weather vane close up, and what do we see? We actually see a representation in the tail of the weather vane of an ear of corn. So that ancient symbol of the harvest, if you will. And we wonder, where did the builders get that? They had so many other architectural things going on with this building. Where did they come up with this design? Well, there was a famous architect, Asher Benjamin from Connecticut, that published a book in the late 1700s called The Country Builder's Assistant. And it is, just as its title is a kind of a construction book. It tells local craftsmen how they can, plans, very simple plans to build, among other things, a meeting house. Now, of course, the architects of Exeter's First Congregational went far and beyond anything Asher Benjamin did. But the cupola of the church in Asher Benjamin's work featured a weather vane that was exactly of this style, very simplistic in nature. And so that's what the architects for Exeter's First Congregational chose. It's a weather vane style that is found in countless buildings all across New England, because Asher Benjamin's work was extremely popular and had widespread distribution. So this is an homage to Asher Benjamin and that regional influence, even here in a otherwise grand church in Exeter. So kind of fascinating. There's another type of weather vane out there. A lot of people, I hear them call it the rooster or the chicken weather vane. We're going to call it the weathercock, because there is a difference. If you have a chicken or a rooster flying over a barn, then it's a rooster or chicken weather vane. But if it's flying over a public structure like an old meeting house or church, then we call it a weathercock. So that's the difference. And there's a reason for that. There's a religious reason for that. Many of our earliest meeting houses in New Hampshire were very simply constructed and adorned, actually had no adornment, as was the Puritan style. But by the late 1600s, early 1700s, there was a falling off of the faith. And as new meeting houses were built, we start to see adornments. We can see the first meeting house in Rye in the center there, and notice the weathercock atop its bell tower there. These became all the rage by the 1720s and were built all across New Hampshire eventually and New England. But why the weathercock? Why is that important? Okay. Well, we have to go far back, and ironically, we don't go back into Puritan times. We go back into Catholic times in Europe. Around the year 820, yes, I said 820, I believe Pope Nicholas, I could be wrong there, decreed that all Catholic churches across the land would fly a weathercock above their buildings. And why was that? Well, because there had been a falling off of the Catholic faith. People were starting to drift away from the church, and the Pope wanted to bring people back to the church. So the rooster plays a very big part at the Last Supper. I think it's in the book of Luke in the Bible, where Christ tells his disciple Peter that thou will thrice deny me before the cock crows in the morning. And that indeed did come to pass. And so the weathercock really is a religious symbol of not only of doubt in someone's faith, but also of calling people back to the faith. And so with those words, Catholic churches all across the land began to mount weathervanes above their churches. The oldest known weathercock in the world comes from an Italian church. It was erected somewhere in 900 or 1000, the year 1000. AD, and it flew in its place for over 800 years. It is now in a museum. So these had long-lasting impact. So let's move forward to early 1700s in New Hampshire and New England, where the Puritan faith had a similar falling off. There's only so much hellfire and brimstone you can preach before people get bored and kind of are less godly, if you will. So that's where many of our town fathers all across New England thought the idea of erecting a weathercock to call out to their people, the congregation, come back to the church, come back. And that's what a weathercock is all about. You can see in Hampstead down there, this is a typical weathercock. It's a Gallic or French style rooster, continental Europe. It's got a long, thin neck. Always his neck is stretched out, and he's got his beak open. He's calling out to the faithful, right? Come back, come back. He's got the widespread tail there, very dramatic. And oftentimes they have the feet on them, clutching that spindle as if they're hanging up in the sky there for dear life. The Hampstead version that you see is the third such weathervane that flies above their meeting house. The first one was erected when the bell tower was put up in the late 1700s, made of wood, painted a gold ochre color. That one deteriorated. A second one was made. It is now in the Hampstead's Town Museum, and this is the more modern version, but a faithful replica of the old one. A beautiful example, very simplistic rural style weathercock. We see a couple other unusual examples in Dover. We know that blacksmith William Garish made this example in Dover, and he probably wasn't quite as skilled. His weathercock is kind of a combination of a standard rooster, and then he's got the fancy tail, but instead of delineating the tail feathers, he just has one hammered sheet of copper there. And the Northampton weathervane above the church there is kind of fascinating because it's got a banner style weathervane with a rooster above is kind of a finial design, so kind of unusual combination there. So these were erected again all across New Hampshire. The one up in Boscawen, when it was erected above that church, was not very popular. It was said not to be very well done. And so the town fathers took it down, and later it was turned into a sign for a local tavern. It's now gone, but so our people did have their quirks and like their weathervanes to be just so. However, the finest of the weathercock weathervanes is down at the Amherst, their second meeting house. It has the oldest church spire in New Hampshire, built in 1771. And this embodies every feature of the weathercock. It's got the tail feathers. It's got the claws that are holding on tight to the spindle. It's got his coxcomb raised in alarm. And he's got his beak wide out, again, calling to the faithful. And notice the glass eye as well. This was actually likely crafted by Thomas Drown of Boston. If any of you have heard the name Drown and Boston together, you may be thinking of Shem Drown, America's first known weathervane maker, who constructed or crafted the copper grasshopper that flies above Faneuil Hall there. That is considered the oldest weathervane, one of the oldest weathervanes in America. And so Thomas Drown learned the craft from his father and practiced all over New England and in New Hampshire. So when you see that, you have a different eye now. We have the knowledge to know that it's different. Now, when you see a chicken or a rooster above a farm, then it's it was probably a chicken farm or something like that. Ship weather vanes are also have been popular for many centuries in New England as well, obviously alluding to our maritime heritage. And again, they have also several different connotations to them. They have religious connotations because, after all, Christ was a fisher of men, so to speak. But they also, denote the local economy and what was going on. So Dover, New Hampshire, the old Methodist church there, built in 1875. It's now a public housing, I believe. Features a type of craft that was very popular, freighting up goods and materials up and down the Cochico River. The Portsmouth Schaefer warehouse weather vane is a replica of one that originally stood on this building, the oldest commercial building in New Hampshire. Most New England towns had right on their waterfront, which is where Schaefer warehouse is, a replica of a ship in weather vane form, sometimes mounted on a building, sometimes mounted on a pole, that would give mariners, captains, as they're coming into port and leaving from port, again, a real-time look at what's going on with the wind, and they can even see how this ship weather vane is moving in the wind. I do like Exeter's weather vane from 1915, when the old academy, or the current Academy Hall, was built. And again, this alludes to perhaps the history of Phillips Academy. Again, its founder was a merchant and trader first, before he opened Phillips Academy. I like this one because it has a name. This was donated by Sidney Smith. I can't remember his middle name, but he was the one that donated it. So it's often referred to by folks on that campus today as the Sidney Smith, the Sidney S, as they look up there. And it's one of the nicest ship weather vanes in all of New England. So again, can be a religious connotations, can have commercial connotations, it can have both. I like them above our centers of learning and wisdom too. The owl, you see a more modern version from Tuftonboro Middle School, but interestingly enough, the owl has been used really since the early 1800s, flying atop centers of learning throughout New Hampshire and the rest of New England, universities, sometimes libraries. Here we've got the owl on one end, and I don't know if that's considered to be a bookworm or whatever it is on the other end. The Gilman Library in Alton is a modern take on the library or educational weather vane, if you will. And it's such an appropriate symbol of, two children back to back reading a book. Designed by local artist Peter Ferber. It has since been copied without his knowledge, by the way, and you can see one atop the Salisbury, Massachusetts Public Library as well. So it's a pretty cool symbol there. The earliest weather vane forms, of course, above any schoolhouse in New Hampshire and New England was the simple quill pen weather vane. And we see a few examples of those that remain above public libraries and, even one-room schoolhouses. I believe the Dame School, I'm trying to remember what community that is. I want to say Nottingham, has a simple quill weather vane, again, to indicate what's going on among the folks below. Of course, the ones that most of us know about outside perhaps our churches and meeting houses are our farm economy, right? So the horse weather vane. The horse weather vane came in so many different styles, over a dozen different styles. Just like, we know, famous athletes today. Horses were the athletes of the day. So many of these different designs had names for them. There was a White Mountain Boy. There was a Hambletonian. The one you see of flying above the barn in Rochester is called the Dexter weather vane. It's for this famous horse back in the day. And he's always pictured with his head down, his hooves charging hard with his tail straight out behind him. On the other hand, the Hobbs Barn in Northampton, now a brewery, used to fly this weather vane. It's Paul Hobbs, I believe one of the last owners of the barn before he passed away, used to shoot at this weather vane as a kid with a .22. And you can see the pockmarks in toward the rear of the weather vane in this image here. This weather vane was actually on the cupola of the large barn that was there. It was stolen back in the 80s and ended up being recovered eventually, thankfully. And so now you see it as it was mounted in Mr. Hobbs' kitchen. And of course, other farm weather vanes, the ones that depict cattle and sheep. Sheep farming, of course, was a big deal in New Hampshire in the late 19th century. So you see a barn with a sheep weather vane today, that's a sure sign that sheep were being raised on that property. I really like this picture from Boscawen. This is almost certainly made by the farmer that owned the barn or a local blacksmith, made out of sheet iron. You can see it rusting away up there. It's a fair representation of a steer. It's not an exact, it's a nice piece of folk art. Clearly, the owner wanted something flying atop his building. It's seen its share of weather, as you can see. What is interesting is note the lightning rods below it. The weather vane was probably struck many more times before the lightning rod was hit. So that's kind of fascinating. Now we ask, all these barn cupolas. The barn cupola really didn't come along, until the mid 1800s. And they were really, just give you a brief architectural history, early barns were very kind of porous in design, or, the siding was not exactly airtight. And so there was enough weather circulating, air circulating through a barn that we had no problems. But once we came up with the idea of board and batten siding to really tighten up a barn, farmers soon discovered that they needed the barn to have ventilation so they could keep the cattle healthy and not have condensation in the barn. So they came up with the cupola design, so something to vent the barn. And it's pretty much law, right? If you have a cupola that high in the air, you got to have a weather vane on it. I'm being facetious, of course, but farmers pretty soon took the notion that if we're going to have a cupola that high, we're going to put a weather vane atop of it. One rural traveler from outside of New Hampshire, in traveling across our state in the late 1800s, said from a distance it looked like every town had some fancy academy or school in it, until he got closer and discovered that it was just a fancy barn cupola. So kind of fascinating there. Once again, points on our New Hampshire skyline, if you will. I also like them because they're symbols of our early heritage, right? Whether it's the Native American influence flying above Ossapee's Town Hall. Now, by the way, that's a replica, an early 20th century replica of a weather vane made by Shem Drown in Boston for the Massachusetts State House in the 1740s, I believe. It's now in the Massachusetts Historical Society Museum. When Shem Drown crafted his weather vane, he was paying tribute to the Native Americans that helped the first Massachusetts settlers. So when we see this, it's entirely appropriate in Ossipee because Route 25 that runs through that town and heads east into Portland, Maine, was called the Ossipee Trail, a Native American highway, so to speak, for long before the white man came to this area. So pays homage to our heritage. Meanwhile, over in Newmarket, you got the Lamprey River Mills, now condos and things like that. But this was a real industrial center back in the day. And when this addition to the mills was built, they placed, appropriately enough, this geared weather vane atop it to really signify what was taking place below. And I'm glad that during the many renovations of this building, that weather vane has stayed in place all these years. That's the danger with some of these buildings. They lose their weather vanes when they lose their purpose and gain a new one. I also like those weather vanes, very popular in the late 1800s. The fire station weather vanes, again, showing what's happening in below, these occupational designs. We see a simple example, a modern example, flying above East Kingston's fire department. It's a replica of what might have been there had that building been constructed in the late 1800s. But the most stunning one is the Concord Warren Street Firehouse weather vane. Now, this is actually a replica made by a well-known weather maker weathervane maker in Hampton, New Hampshire. But the original that once flew there was taken down when the building was decommissioned, turned into apartments. And the firefighters kept it. They kind of had a fight with the town about who owned the weathervane. And it now sits in the basement of the Broad Street Firehouse in their so-called fire museum. It's really just a small room with fire station memorabilia. If you take a journey up to Concord, go up, right on North Main Street, the firehouse there, ask them if you can come in and see their fire museum. If they have the time, they'll gladly let you in there. And you can see this fully articulated weathervane, about 6 feet long, of an Amoskeag fire engine built right in the real fire engines that were constructed in Manchester, New Hampshire, pulled by a couple horse. You can see the boiler at the end. You can see the men that are manning it. So pretty fascinating weathervanes. These were once very popular all over New England. This is the only one that's still in place in New Hampshire. Firehouses in Nashua and Manchester had them, but they have all been lost over the years. Manchester's was lost during a renovation, and it ended up somehow in the Shelburne Museum in Vermont, which has one of the largest weathervane collections anywhere. Manchester would like to have it back, but Shelburne has rebuffed them on that. So in Shelburne, it shall stay. I also like weathervanes because they really serve as a nice town landmarks, right? If you're in my town of Wolfboro, if you've ever come up here in the summer, you've almost certainly seen our old train depot, and with the locomotive weathervane. Once again, these were very popular throughout New England, flying above train stations, Boston and Maine train stations, and others. This is a replica. When this building, again, was being renovated in the 1980s, the original was taken down and is lost. I'm told it's in someone's house in Wolfboro, but I haven't been able to figure out whose. On the other hand, the Methodist Church in Lancaster, a very tall structure, one of the last churches in New England to feature a period weathervane that shows the angel Gabriel, blowing her trumpet. Once a very common weathervane design, first in wood and then in metal. These are extremely rare now. If they were to take it down and sell it, they could probably get 6 figures, if not even more. By the way, the most expensive weathervane in the world was acquired by a collector in New York, the Loren family of fashion fame. They bought it for $5 million. And it's not even as old as the Lancaster's weathervane. This weathervane, I tell the story of this type of weathervane, is also the first. It was featured on a religious stamp in U.S. history. One of the first Christmas stamp that came out in the 1960s featured a weathervane in the angel Gabriel form. Now that one came from Newburyport, but in this same very similar form. Beginning in the 1850s, the weathervanes moved from the handmade to the kind of factory made, with a caveat that these factories were very small. The bodies of them were made by hand stamping equipment, but features like on an eagle, the heads, the feet were added, and they were all gilded by hand. And again, Waltham was a major area where these precision weather instruments were made. We all know Waltham was known for its watches and, of course, the early industrial complex, but they also made weathervanes. A.J. Harris and Company weathervanes can be found all over New Hampshire and New England. They were of a lesser design, I don't want to say lesser quality, more mass produced, but so we went from local weathervane makers to these regional weathervane makers that would supply greater areas. And some of these factory-made weathervanes, make no mistake about it, are extremely collectible if they're of an unusual figure. If they're just a simple design that was commonplace, then they're less valuable. But the more unusual design, the more desired they are by collectors. This is one of my favorite weathervane stories I tell in my book about a New Hampshire-inspired weathervane. If you've heard of the artist, the sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens over in Cornish, when they were building Madison Square Garden, an earlier version of that, in the early 1900s in New York, the architect of that building, Stanford White, was a good friend of St. Gaudens. And so he commissioned him to make a weather vane. And so this New Hampshire artist sculpted this weather vane, and then it was crafted in a factory in Ohio. And it was placed above the Madison Square Garden building. And it was a largest weather vane of its day. It was 18 feet tall, as you can see on the left. It's the version of the hunter goddess Diana, and she's got her bow and arrow there. More importantly, she's got her cape fashioned in copper plate. And notice her foot. She's on one foot, balanced on that ball, and you can see how large it is by the men that are standing below. Here's the problem. That weather vane was not properly balanced, and so it did not spin in the wind. To add to that, there was controversy even before the weather vane was placed, for many New Yorkers were a little prudish and said, you know what, we can't put a nude figure above New York's skyline. The artist, Augustus St. Gaudens, said, you know what, we can wrap her in cloth and she'll be properly clothed. And I think he knew what was going to happen, because within days of her being erected atop the building, the cloth flew away. And of course, there was Diana naked as she had been originally planned to be. But she didn't spin in the wind. So this was a great embarrassment to the architect and to New Yorkers in general. So the original Diana was taken down, as you see on the left, and she was shipped off to some agricultural exposition building in Chicago, which eventually burned, and that weather vane was lost. Now, the replacement made by St. Gaudens is one of his most famous sculptures. Again, the hunter goddess Diana in more simplified form, without the scarf, and only 14 feet tall instead of 18 feet tall. And again, she flew above the New York skyline many years until that version of Madison Square Garden came down. And then she was put in storage before she was acquired by the Philadelphia Museum of Art, regilded, and so she occupies a prominent space. So I like to say a kind of Roman goddess, created in the mind of a New Hampshire artist. And, for all the world to see in New York City is kind of a fascinating connection between our two places. It was also a significant weather vane in that it was the first item to be illuminated on the New York skyline. So these are just some of the stories that we see out there. Our local stories I like even better. For example, the Baker Library Dartmouth College weather vane of 1928 pays homage to the history of that educational institution, which was at first designed for Native Americans. And here we can see the image of the founder, Eleazar Wheelock, lecturing to a Native American there who was smoking a pipe. Recently, there have been calls for this weather vane to be taken down. By the way, the trees kind of represent the wilds of New Hampshire and Hanover. Why do people want the weather vane taken down? Well, because behind Eleazar Wheelock, there is a representation of a barrel of rum. And sometimes that's what was used, it was said, to entice Native Americans to come to the campus. So a little bit of controversy there. Luckily, that seems to have died down, and the weather vane has stayed in place. Of course, the old man in the mountain has long been gone now, but he flies above the Brown Church up in Conway. He's a little crooked these days, but nonetheless, a really fine example of what you can see out there as you're traveling around. So I tell people, spring and fall are great times to get out there and see what's in the sky. Make sure you have someone driving you around. You don't want to do that while you're driving on your own. And if you want the full story of some weather vane makers in New Hampshire and New England, check out my book. And there's over 400 pictures in there that document many stories like the one we've told tonight. So with that in mind, we'll open it up for questions. If anybody, I guess, Laura, you can help me out with this. We'll go from there.
Yeah, thank you. We have 3 questions so far. The first is there a lot of weather vane theft these days?
So that's interesting, and I tell the full story in my book. So we don't see it a lot today. If we do see it, it's usually something that's being stolen for its metals and things like that. It's hard to steal weather vanes and sell them on the antique market today, mainly because word gets out quick when a weather vane is stolen, and an antique dealer, a scrupulous one anyway, might get wind of that, and so would be hesitant to purchase it. But back in the late 70s, early 80s, there was actually a gang of criminals in New Hampshire called the Yellow Station Wagon Gang, and they drove around in, yes, a yellow station wagon around southern New Hampshire and beyond, and mostly rural towns, and they would scope out these towns by day, and at night they would go to these barns and mostly barns and places, and they would steal the weather vanes. When they were finally caught, in their glove box was a antique guide to weather vanes, and in their back of the station wagon was a whole jumbled heap of weather vanes that they had taken off the roofs of various barns. Most of them they climbed up, or they used the farmer's own ladder to get up there. There are many apocryphal stories about helicopter thefts. Actually, very few of these are documented in New Hampshire. I only know of one incident. Most of the time, these were people that could climb well, and were willing to risk their necks to steal these things. Interestingly enough, by 1980, New Hampshire had one state trooper whose only job was to track weather vane thefts. Quickly, that died out after they caught the gang. Later on, about 5 years later, they saw a rise again in weather thefts. And a quick check turned out that the bunkmate of the weather vane stealer, when he got out of prison, decided he would take up that line of work. So it's kind of fascinating, but there was a time when weather vanes were, as people were beginning to realize that there was, this kind of treasure in the sky, they were stolen. So the most unique weather vane I see from Jonathan here about the most unique weather vane that I have seen. That's a good question. I mean, I think singular, there used to be a serpent weather vane that flew above a mill down in Alstead, New Hampshire. I think it was an unusual design. I'm sorry, not a serpent, a dragon. It was an unusual design for that type of building. So I would kind of put that up there. I haven't studied, since there are no Amish in New Hampshire, I really haven't studied Amish weather vanes, so I can't really answer your question there. And boy, you're putting me on the spot. If I could put a vane on my roof, what would I choose? I don't know. I have a small weather vane collection. I have an aircraft weather vane. I love old aircraft. I like some of the animal weather vanes. I might put a loon weather vane up there. I don't know. I like loons, so I might do that. But that answer could change in 10 minutes. So I don't really have an definitive answer. Carol asks about fish weather vanes. Good question. Very common in many seacoast area towns, not in New Hampshire, interestingly enough, but especially in Massachusetts. Of course, the codfish built Massachusetts. That's almost a symbol of that state because of the cod fishery. So in the states of Maine and Massachusetts, cod weather vanes above Meeting House and even State House were very common, and you can see fine examples today. You go up into Kennebunk, for example, or you go down to Marblehead, and certainly Gloucester, Massachusetts. We do see a few on some private buildings in Portsmouth, but oddly enough, New Hampshire has such a short seacoast. And, we were all about freighting. New Hampshire obviously had fisheries too, but the cod fishery was not our biggest deal. So less common in New Hampshire than the rest of New England.
Okay.
Looks like anything I see in the chat, I've gotten taken care of. If we have anything out there, I can stick around for a few minutes. You see my email. Anybody can email me if you have questions or if you're interested in my book, or you can order my book directly. I always like to see local booksellers get the business. Water Street Books is a great venue. So either way.
We have one comment on Facebook. Just very, very interesting. Thank you for a unique view that now will have me paying closer attention.
Yeah, that's the whole goal. I mean, is that we look at things. Sometimes we don't notice these. A lot of these weather vanes. We're kind of so busy in our daily lives, we don't think of these things. But there's a pretty cool history behind them, and as a historian, of course, that's what I like. I would like to thank everyone who checked in with us here, and everyone on TV and whatever media you're on. I really appreciate you tuning in. And I hope you find this topic as fascinating as I do. And I hope you all have a great rest of the winter. And we're looking for spring, aren't we?
Thank you, Glenn. We really appreciate you doing the presentation tonight.
All right. Thank you very much, Laura. We'll see you in the future, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
All right. Everybody have a great evening.
Good night.
Well, good night.